Welcome to the Menstruality podcast, where we share inspiring conversations about the power of menstrual cycle awareness and conscious menopause. This podcast is brought to you by Red School, where we're training the menstruality leaders of the future. I'm your host, Sophie Jane Hardy, and I'll be joined often by Red School's founders, Alexandra and Shani, as well as an inspiring group of pioneers, activists, changemakers, and creatives to explore how you can unashamedly claim the power of the menstrual cycle to activate your unique form of leadership for yourself, your community, and the world. Hey, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to share this one with you. I enjoyed this conversation so much. So perhaps you, like many of us in the Red School community, have this intuitive, instinctual longing to connect to the wildness within you, to the feminine within you. And as our guest today, Michaela Boehm says in her book, The Wild Woman's Way, we're longing to connect to the ancient part of us that knows the rising of the moon and the movement of the tides, the instinctual, deeply connected aspects in each of us that has survived and thrived in the wilderness for many thousands of years. And today in our conversation, we look at how to rewild ourselves, how to come home to our bodies, to pleasure, how to move from doing to being, even amidst all of the busyness and challenges of modern life. And as I mentioned, our guide is the wise and wonderful Michaela Boehm, who's known for her work with high-performing individuals, including Oscar-winning actors and Grammy-winning musicians. She is good. She's the founder of the nonlinear movement method, a powerful somatic release modality, and her work has recently been featured in Gwyneth Paltrow's Netflix show Sex, Love and Goop, and Will Smith's best-selling memoir, Will. We look at Michaela's story of her childhood longing to become a witch, her early years apprenticing with her mentor, and how she eventually became the holder of an ancient female-held tantric lineage. We look at why we need to be able to access both our go mode and our flow mode as women living in our modern world. And we hear about the embodiment practices that enable Michaela to live this big, wildly creative life without burning out. So let's get started with coming home to our wild, instinctual, embodied wisdom with Michaela Boehm. So thank you so much, Michaela, for joining us. I know everyone in our community is going to be delighted to hear from you. And I have so many questions, but I wondered if we could start where we always start with this podcast, which is to check in around how we are cyclically. So I'm not sure where you're at with your journey with your menstrual cycle or menopause process, but I wondered if you minded sharing through that lens how you're doing today.
Yeah, well, I am now officially menopausal. So just for a few, I mean, now I guess I'm postmenopausal because it's been a year and 3 months. So,
Yes.
it's all very, technical, I guess. But I'm 56 now, so it's fairly late in the game as far as, I had very regular cycles till fairly recently, and then had pretty much 1 year where there was some transition, and then that was that. And so where I'm at, I'm still very much feeling like there is cycles, even I'm no longer bleeding, and which is quite interesting to note and not always entirely pleasant to say it very nicely. But at least, one of the things that I've always liked, I've been always very, very regular and always really loved bleeding and really loved being in my body with everything. And so I'm still really quite enjoying that there's still cycles, because it feels right and it feels natural. And at the same time, it's also quite puzzling, that of course the cycles take on different meanings. And like I said, it's not always pleasant. It's a lot better now than in the first couple of months of not bleeding, where it was pretty heinous, to say the least. But yeah, so that's where I'm at.
Thank you for sharing that. Do you connect with the cycles of the moon? Is that a part of what you feel like you're cycling with, or are these cycles that are coming from inside you that you're tracking?
Well, I would say that when I still was bleeding, I was lined up with the moon.
Mm.
Because I'm very, very lucky in the sense that I live out in nature in a place where there's very little light pollution. Even though I'm about 2 hours north of Los Angeles, it's in a valley and it's somewhat secluded. And we have a law in the area where I live that there's no streetlights. And there's
Wow.
very little, yeah. So it's quite dark. And of course, when you actually get to have dark nights and bright days and things like that, the body lines up quite, at least my body lined up quite easily. And so I'm still somewhat on the moon, but now it's more that through several weeks of the month, certain things are happening. So it's no longer, building up to the event of the release. It's more like I feel really, really energetic, and then I get like puffy, and then I get kind of gnarly, and then I get really puffy, and then when I'm about to lose my mind, I'm fine again, right? So it's more like it's more that kind of a cycle, and I'm still tracking it for certain symptoms because I think it's very informative, but it's not as clear cut anymore.
Fascinating. I mean, I could spend a whole hour talking to you about just that, but there are so many topics I'd love us to explore. And as I was dreaming into this conversation, obviously you have decades of experience on multiple levels around intimacy, sexuality, embodiment, and but it feels like what it all comes back to is coming home to our bodies, coming home to the wisdom and intelligence, the natural intelligence in our bodies. And I wondered if we could track that through your story. Because there are some, I mean, I'm fascinated by your life story. There are certain pieces that I want to pull out. Like, you described how you grew up as a girl in Austria and what you really wanted to be was a witch. And I wondered if you could walk us into that. What was life like for you in the wilds of Austria?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because the book, of course, that you're referring to is The Wild Woman's Way, and The Wild Woman's Way is about the archetype of the wild woman, which is the part of us that comes back to nature. It's not like a lot of people think, frothing at the mouth and screaming and clawing the walls. It's actually the exact opposite. It's rewilding into our cycles and our bodies and our nervous system, regulating and integrating. And that entire thing that you're talking about, the coming back to our body and coming back to nature via our body, is kind of our birthright. And it not kind of, it is our birthright. It's just that if you're not exposed to it in the early days, then it's much, much harder to feel back into it. And I was really, really lucky in the sense that I grew up. Austria is I mean, it's not unpopulated. It's quite populated for its square footage, but it has a lot of natural world. I mean, yeah, I grew up about 25 minutes outside of Salzburg, and you're in nature. There is houses, but there's pastures and there's mountains and there's unoccupied spaces. And I grew up at a time and a place where my life was essentially I had to go to school, reluctantly, but I had to go to school. And then I would come home and do my homework, or not, as quickly as possible. And then I went outside all through the spring and the summer and the fall, not in the winter so much because it's really, really, or it used to be really, really cold. It's not as bad anymore. But so I essentially spent from like 2 or 3 in the afternoon till sundown outside, unsupervised, essentially, because there was nothing to really worry about. You know, in the context of where I grew up and the environment and society in that place of Austria and that time, of course. So I was just out, and my entire life revolved around, you know, climbing on the backs of cows because there were no horses to be found, and climbing on trees, and rowing an old door over a pond, which, you know, my parents are still terrified of because I couldn't swim at that point, you know, and stuff like that. So, and, you know, animals, and I always had snakes and lizards as pets, and, you know, all of that. So with that said, I had that kind of an upbringing. And then I was given a book by, well, I call him my uncle, but of course he wasn't an uncle. He was the godfather of my father. So we weren't technically related, but, you know, very strong family affinity. And it was a book about, you know, very powerful witches and women. And so I
Wow.
decided right then and there that was going to be my gig. And it was fairly easy to, and now I didn't really know what that meant in its entirety, but in the book, there's a lot of wildcrafting and herb lore and spells and things like that. And in the part of Austria where I grew up, that's very easy to come by. Probably now even less and more, meaning there's more emphasis on it now again, but way back when there were still traditional herbal healers in every village, essentially. And you could find people, which I did, who, you know, wrote books and had manuals and showed me, and, you know, and everybody knows where to pick the mushrooms and where to get the blackberries and all of that. So I was very lucky to have gotten very early on entry and education in that. And I also have to say that I have incredible parents who didn't, you know, immediately squash my ambitions, you know,
Yes.
which of course makes a big difference when my parents were like, okay, well, you want to learn these things, go ahead. Here's how you do this. This is what you do. And you know, I produced these very bizarre pasta sauces out of wild picked herbs and stuff that must have been endless, but my parents ate no problem.
I love
So
this. I love
yeah.
this. At Red School, we do quite a lot of work around the menarche, the first period experiences. Alexandra and Shani, who run Red School, they describe how it's like the calling, our purpose awakens when
Mm,
the first blood comes
mm,
in. And I was
mm.
curious if you remember your first periods and like what was happening around at that time.
Yeah, I did. I do. I think I started with, like, along the path of inquiry quite a while before that, because I was a late bleeder, so to speak.
Yeah.
I didn't actually get my, well, I mean, late now, particularly. I didn't get my first period till I was 15.
Mm.
And so I was already kind of on my path. And I was probably one of the last of my girlfriends, of my close girlfriends, getting my period. So it was a little bit like, okay, you know, when is it happening already? And so it was also, I would say, I don't know exactly how to say it, because it was just this, you know, it was just the thing, right? There wasn't anything negative, but there wasn't anything, you know, nobody went, you're a woman now, we have to have a ceremony. None of that happened. It was just like, oh, okay, fine. Yeah, you know, here's some pads and this is what you do, and cool. And so, you know, my mother was very matter of fact about it, but not dismissive, and there was no negative around it. It was just not that big of a deal. And I do think, though, that because my mother was quite, you know, matter of fact about it, it wasn't a big deal in the positive way as well. So I never really had a lot of attention on, I had cramps and stuff like that, of course, but it was never like, oh, you need to be in bed or you can't do things or whatever. It was always more like, okay, well, this is how you do this, and this is how you do that, and here's how you work with tampons, and so it was kind of it wasn't a thing, and because
Yeah.
it wasn't a thing, I've always had a very good and happy kind of time with my period and around all of that. I've always known when I ovulated, I could feel it. My mother told me what that felt like. I felt it.
Mm.
That was the end of that. So it was very, let's say, ordinary in
Yeah.
the best possible way.
Yeah. I mean, what I'm hearing is no shame. There's a lot of
No,
literature now and evidence and
yeah,
research around shaming experiences at menarche and then ongoing menstrual problems. So it's great to hear. And that she taught you how to feel your ovulation, that she was that body literate in that way. That's exciting.
yeah,
Yeah. Mm.
yeah. Yeah, so I was like, oh, I have this weird thing. And she goes, essentially, where are you on your cycle? Oh, yeah, that's what that is. And then that was the end of that, and
Yeah.
and so it was very matter of fact and very no fuss. But I appreciate that, and I think in the context of in general my upbringing and sexuality, that's was my parents' gift, that they weren't, it was neither good nor bad. It was just it. Didn't have
Mm.
extra layers, and those not extra layers, I think, were a really wonderful gift.
I feel that the
Mm,
neutrality, the blank slate that you could then just write whatever you wanted to on it. That's beautiful. And there was another key figure in your life, possibly entered in around now, Deepa, your teacher. And I really wanted to ask you about her because it's very rare to be mentored in that way in that early phase of life in your 20s. And you describe in the book how she started by teaching you how to make tea, and you were like sweeping the floors for her to do her chalk mandalas, and then eventually she started to share the teachings of Kashmir Shaivism with you, which I've been blessed to receive some teachings in a different context that unfortunately was very unethical and difficult,
mm,
but
yeah.
I'm grateful for the teachings.
Mm,
Yeah, I just wondered if you could share with us, it's a big question, but some of the core things that you carry with you from Deepa, from your time with
mm,
her.
mm. It's an interesting question in the context of where I'm sitting now versus where I would have said what I would have said maybe even 5 years ago, pre-pandemic potentially.
Mm,
And I don't know exactly how to say this. I used to give my teacher much more credit than my, let's say, upbringing. But when I'm now where I'm sitting, and I think it's a combination of having been quite isolated during the pandemic through a set of circumstances, and also, menopause and some other life changes that occurred all around the same time, that I can now look back, and this dovetails in what when you asked me about my mother and my first period, is that I can now really see that my mother set the or prepared the ground and really set the context for the life in which I could have a teacher and in which I could become a teacher and a mentor. And so nowadays, and my mother thankfully is still alive, and so she gets to reap the benefits of my realizations in a certain way. Nowadays, I can see that a lot of the things that Deepa cultivated in me actually were instilled or started in my upbringing. My mother's, the way she did things and the way things in my household were done, and a certain kind of a orientation towards beauty and ritual and offerings and hospitality and generosity. All of those things were given to me by my mother. But you, of course, can't see that when you're, when you're young. You have to kind of break free from that a bit. And I had the really amazing joy and privilege of breaking free from it with somebody who still instilled the same kind of uh, I want to say values, but values is of course a bit of a fraught way of saying it, but orientations in me, and that's probably why I took to it. And so the way she taught was essentially she would give you something to do, and then based on if you would do it or not, next things would happen. And that's an interesting way of mentoring, of course. And that's a very, you have to have ovaries of steel, so to speak, to mentor like that, right? Because it's a very hands-off, self-starting and self-responsible way of engaging with any form of inquiry and teaching, in the sense that there was nothing forthcoming till I asked.
Mm.
Right? There was nothing forthcoming till I made a move, so to speak. There was nothing forthcoming till I solved the riddle, so to speak, of whatever it was. And it wasn't like I'm giving you a riddle. It was not a Zen kind of a situation, right? It was just like, try this. Try this. And so tea making was one of the first things I learned in that context, where it was like, okay, feel this ingredient, smell this ingredient, pulverize this ingredient to various stages, taste it, steep it this long, steep it that long, and then I had to kind of like experiment with that. And then the next ingredient came and the next ingredient. And so it was very, very, I mean, it was glacial, right? And it's kind of funny because, of course, nowadays where I'm full-time teaching and mentoring and working with people, when you see that kind of attention span now versus when I grew up, of course, right? And this kind of stuff no longer really works like that, unfortunately, because there is something about that slow simmer, in which you can learn a skill and also find out what you're willing and not willing to do, or what your propensities are, or where your weaknesses are. And I look back at it now and I can really see the gift. When you're in your 20s, you're just a punk, essentially. I mean, at least I can talk about anyone else, but I was a punk, right? I was definitely had a very inflated view of my experience or my intellect or whatever, right? And so I must have been hell for everyone involved,
It feels meaningful in in the context of rewilding the feminine, that it was glacial. I'm thinking of a teacher of mine who I said, I really want to connect more to the Celtic mysteries, or like the teachings of this land. And she said, well, look, there are people teaching it, but just go and find your rivers, go and find the wells, go and sit with them, listen to them, walk the pathways, be with the animals. And I have been for the past years, and it's like my body is learning rather than my head, I guess I could say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that was pretty much, a big part of what I was taught and am teaching now. But of course, you lose those things on occasion. When particularly as I started a career, I lost a bit of it, and then it came back. And yeah, I have to do the same here. And still, I'm still connecting with the land, and everywhere I go, I have to always connect with the land freshly and learn more. And that's how you learn. And I still teach like that to a certain degree, that I give practices and then I see what people come back with. And if people are just coming back with wanting more without actually having mined, the wisdom of what was given, which is mostly the case, right? It's like, well, can I have another practice? And it's like, well, you haven't really done this practice, but yeah, can I have another practice? What are other practices, right? Anytime I hear what are other practices, I know that it's a skipping over. But some people, that's how they learn. They accumulate and then maybe they go back. And I wasn't really allowed to accumulate and go back. I was just doled out bits by bits. And a lot of the things I was actually taught and given didn't unpack themselves till I was in my 40s.
Yeah.
So now still I look back and I go, oh, yeah, now this makes sense. Like retroactively, this makes sense, but it didn't make, or it didn't even register back then.
Wow.
So yeah,
Wow, what gifts, like seeds planted in your
totally.
being and your consciousness that are now coming to flower. Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm going to pause this conversation with Michaela just for a moment to share an invitation with you. We have a free online event coming up hosted by Alexandra and Shani. It's called Awaken Your Cycle Power. It's a live exploration of how we can all take this homecoming journey to the power that lives within us, within our cyclical nature. It's on Wednesday, June the 5th, and you can take your seat at redschool.net/cycle power. It's for you if you long to explore the cyclical intelligence within you, whether you have a regular cycle, challenging cycles, irregular cycles, perhaps in your 40s in the run up to menopause, or if you no longer have a menstrual cycle. We would love to have you with us. We'll gather for an hour and a half to look at the power that lives in the cycle, how you can awaken it through befriending your inner seasons, these 4 phases of the cycle, and how you can embody this power to literally transform everything in your world, which has definitely been my experience of menstrual cycle awareness. The event will also serve as an introduction to our new Cycle Power course, which you can read more about at redschool.net/cycle power. So you mentioned that you lost it a little as you embarked upon this career in LA, in West Hollywood, eventually. This hugely successful relationship counseling practice. And then at a certain point, I think, in fact, it might have been in the book, you were describing that you were working with clients in England and you were reminded of the land of Austria in your childhood. And you realized, oh, the land. I need to get back to the land. And that's when you found your land and you found your animals. And can you tell us a bit about that process?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, oh, this is so much. They are great questions, but they're very, we need weeks. But I think one of the things that worked both in my favor and also against me in a certain ways, and it's, I think, important to say as a broader point, right? I do have a fairly good head on my shoulders, and what I mean by that is I have substantial cognitive ability. That's the best way I can say it, and willingness to organize concepts and do things and achieve things. And so I think there's a bit of, nowadays particularly, there's a bit of fetishization of just the feminine, just the body, just the flowing and being with the flow. And I taught a guest, like I did some guest teaching yesterday, and everybody was like swaying on Zoom. And it's like, it's like, yes, but you're here to learn something, and that actually requires that you engage your head and have rational thinking, because you do need intellectual underpinning so you can, this was a practitioner training, so you can support somebody else. It's not enough to and sway. As much as you can do that for yourself at home, you must also use your head and use your capacities, because we're not in the 50s and we're not little housewives, and all the pseudo neo-tantric stuff around is all good and nice, but it's it's not the 50s anymore. And just being the surrendered feminine is a gross reduction of what a woman is capable of. And so, that all said, I don't think there's anything wrong with going into the head, getting shit done, having a career, achieving something, as long as you still have the other thing going as well. Right? It's not an either or, it's a both. And sometimes you have to be a bit heavier on one than the other for other reasons, for various reasons. So for instance, if you're about to give birth, you're pregnant, things like that, you're going to be very heavily leaning on the body, and you're not going to be cultivating, your career as much. But then at some point in your life, early, particularly, or particularly if you want children at some point, it's perfectly all right to kind of lean heavily into skill acquisition and career and, creating resources, because then you're also independent and you can do it when you want to
Yes.
dial back from that, which I think is really, really important,
Yeah, well,
really
you were
important.
able to go and buy this land
Yeah,
based on the back
yeah,
of this brilliant
yeah,
career. Yeah, that is
yeah,
exactly what I thought as I read the book. See, this is
yeah,
it. She
yeah,
has, yeah, she's working that, like you talk about do and flow. There's the
yeah,
do
go and
mode.
flow. Yes,
Sorry, there's the
go
go
and flow.
mode and the flow
Yes,
mode. And you're like, ah,
yes.
yes, she's got both of them.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's the thing, right? It's the thing you can't have just go, you're stuck in your head and completely disembodied. You can't just have flow, because you won't be able to organize yourself in any meaningful way. You need both, and then you need to know when you need what. And so I had a period of quite intense, let's say, career and skill acquisition periods. And that was not entirely pleasant, in the sense that, West Hollywood, even back then, it was a very busy, loud, um, intrusive, kind of, not super dangerous, but also not an easy place. And but it was where I built a practice and had a career, and I taught regular women's groups even back then, and it was not a problem. I was on one of the main drags. People could pop in, So I built a business based on that. I also, in addition to that, saw clients in a drug rehab, which I helped create and ran for a while. That was kind of a very, very heavily traumatized dual diagnosis situation, where we used, let's say, what was back then called alternative methods, meaning it wasn't just 12-step, it was massage, it was acupuncture, it was nutrition, it was workouts, it was life purpose, it was subconscious work, it was psychology, it was everything. And so I would see 8 or 9 clients there, then go back to my office, see another 2, 3 people there. So I did very, very long days of very heavy clinical work, and then teach on top of that. And in the beginning, also keep a job going, so I wasn't dependent on one income, because when you build a practice, it's not always, people go on summer vacation and you're like, shit. And then, of course, they come back, and then you go, well, I wish I would have taken some time off, right? But in the early days of being self-employed, you don't know. So
No.
all of that said, I did all of that. And then I had the incredible fortune of being able to buy the land that I'm on now. And what it doesn't say in the book, because that came after, and it will be in the next book, is that then that property burnt down to the ground in a wildfire, right? Well, as I was handing in the book, actually, my deadline was December 15th, and the house burned on December 4th. So you get the idea. So that all said, there was a cycle of intense mental and physical demand on my capacity as a, let's say, businesswoman, how far, for lack of a better word. And then when I came kind of back to being on the land, that really shifted back to, I could see the sunrise every morning. I could see the sunset every evening. I started traveling and teaching. I didn't go into the office every day anymore. And it really slowed me down, and it really oriented me back to, where I kind of started, growing herbs, growing medicinal plants, having chickens, having goats, having pigs, all of the things that allowed me to kind of come back to where I started, so to speak, in a different iteration. And
I love that. You were like, I'm a witch. It's
I'm a
happened.
witch. I
Yeah.
know it can happen. I'm definitely a witch now, and it's one of my greatest pleasures. I always had a vision of this fenced-in herb garden that provided kind of the support for being able to support women. That's pretty damn close to how I envisioned it. And of course, once the house burned down and I had to rebuild everything, it pretty much looks exactly how I envision it, as far as the layout of the vegetable gardens and the herb gardens and stuff. So I feel incredibly fortunate on one end, and also I would say that it still takes an enormous amount of 24/7 to maintain all different aspects of what I'm doing in a day, between the house and the gardens and the orchards and the animals and my public teaching and my private teaching and my one-on-one clients and my writing and running a business. It's definitely it's a lot.
It's a big life, that is. That's a big life. I'm listening. I'm paying attention because that kind of land is my dream, and I'm in the go phase. I'm in the building, and it's yeah, it asks a lot. And one of the things I so appreciated about the book, I was listening to it as I was on the rowing machine at the gym this morning, when you were listing all of the different possibilities that exist for us as women in this era. You know, you named that because of the pill, we were freed up from this like endless child rearing out of control. And that I've written it down somewhere. Um, there are a dizzying variety of versions of woman to which we can aspire. Boardroom executive, mother, entrepreneur, homemaker, vixen in the bedroom, visionary, academic, artist, yogini, leader, goddess, scientist, earth mother, warrior, like it goes on and on. And I felt so seen by that because it was right there for me this morning. I came back from the gym. I've got to pack the lunchbox for my little one, take him to nursery before I start my full work day. And I can tell I'm not in flow. And I can tell I'm being with my husband. And he reacts to me. We end up having a fight. Everyone's crying. I'm in a puddle of tears. And I'm like, this is it. This is the quandary. This is I'm trying to do everything and still have this sexual fire with this man that I've been married to for 7 years, who I do like blessedly still find so attractive, which is very helpful. But yeah, I was just nodding and saying, yes, what do we do? What do we do as women wanting to be with the wild woman archetype and having such a full life with it?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a difference between having it all and having the things we want, right? Because the myth of having it all is certainly a myth. You can't have it all. And there's reasons for that that I can go into, but we can't have it all. There is choices that need to be made. There's only so many hours in a day, and there's only so much energy we have. And so there's no human possible way that you can have it all at once. However, you can have different things at different times in your life, and you can certainly have different strands of engagement at the same time. But the important piece, I think, is to know in what a phase you are, right? You said you're in a building phase, and clearly you're in a building phase everywhere. Your relationship is relatively young, right? I mean, 7 years is a decent amount of time, but still, right? You're still in the, and then you have a small child, and then that, of course, means that's a building phase, right? And then there's a business building phase. And so in that phase, there are certain things that will have to go. And they will have to go not because they're not available to you or you shouldn't have them or couldn't have them, but because you want to manage your energy responsibly so you don't burn out. And that's not to say that you can't have them later, or you can't have them on occasion, but there is choices to be made, right? And some of these choices, they're just choices. Some of these choices feel like sacrifice, or at least things that you could later regret, right? Technically. And thankfully for us humans, we typically don't, examine every choice that carefully, because otherwise we'd probably go mad. But it is a thing, right? And so I think when I work with people, and this is true for myself, the thing that you want to look at is what is the purpose of your life in this particular moment? And then with that, what's the purpose of your relationship? And when you say, okay, the purpose of our relationship right now is we're mothering and fathering a small child, with everything that means, needing extra resources, needing extra help, having to, get, I mean, you have it a bit better than people in America, because I'm assuming it, nursery and all of that is not as expensive, but nonetheless, you need more resource, you need more tribe, you need more support, you need, you need. And then that, of course, influences your intimate relationship, because your primary responsibility in life isn't lovers, it's parents, right? And that's sometimes a bit of a rough moment, but if you look at it in a long time, what great privilege to be able to raise a child and do those things. And so the key isn't to go, well, I can't now have that sexy wonderful part of me. It's just you have to put it in a perspective. It's not the first thing that comes out to play. It shouldn't be the last thing that comes out to play, but it's not the first thing that comes out to play. So the way you arrange that in your body is that you go, I have these things that are more in the go domain, let's say, right? And then I have this part of my life, which I am going to maintain, but perhaps not deepen, or perhaps it even goes back a tiny little bit, but it will come back. So then you go, how do I cultivate that? Well, probably taking time, aside for just the two of you, where you don't talk about the kid, the dog, the gas bill, or who needs to buy dog food tomorrow, or so you have to kind of take it out and say, okay, well, maybe we only have once a week or so. And I'm not a big fan of date nights per se, but most people now have to schedule things, so there's nothing wrong. The thing about date night that I don't approve of is when you think that that's the time you have to have sex, because that's a disaster waiting to happen. But you have to say, this is the time you and I have intimate connection, where it's just you and I, and we don't talk about the kid and the dog and the job and the bills and the errands, but we talk about things we're thinking about, things we've heard and read, things we want to communicate to each other. Maybe we don't talk at all and sit by the lake and dangle our feet in the water or whatever, right? So you do have to make time for that, and you have to allow for that. And then, of course, when you know that that's on the program, you will have to prepare for it the way you would prepare for any date, right? If you're dating somebody freshly, you would never just roll out of the house in whatever you were just cleaning the kitchen and still have a Zoom meeting going on and kind of writing some notes. You wouldn't do that. You would actually put attention on yourself, on getting ready, on having a good time, and on your partner. And that never should change. And that's not a should as in you should, but that's just common courtesy and plain good sense. But no, we can't do it all. And having priorities and knowing what season you're in is super important. And then, there are some things that do fall by the wayside. And while I would say that, I lead a very big and busy and, you know, bizarre in many ways, good, bizarre life. But some of the things I get to do in my regular week is most people can't even imagine, in the sense that, I have I have multiple celebrity clients at a time who do really amazing stuff that I get to see and be part of and partake in. And I have an incredible set of friends and neighbors and support with whom I get to do really cool stuff, and I get to do all these different teaching things and blah blah blah, and I have all the dogs who live with me. We live as a pack, which is both really wonderful and sometimes also quite heavy duty. So all of that said, I do have a big life, but I had to make some very strong choices, which some people would not want to make, right? And for instance, I did not have children by choice, not by lack of fertility, but by choice. And that's never an easy choice, and it's certainly not a choice that most people wouldn't make that choice. And it makes me someone very specific in other people's view, not in mine. I really, I don't walk around going, are people thinking, I don't have it because I don't have that kind of environment. But ever so often when I get interviewed or something, people are like, aren't you regretting this? Don't you feel incomplete? Are you barren? Like those kind of things where I'm going, barren? You know,
Don't
but
think we
that's
can
how
use
people,
that word.
right?
Yeah.
But that's how people think and operate. And then, of course, if you are somebody who wanted children and couldn't have them, or didn't find somebody to have them with, I can just imagine how shit this, that kind of view feels. And of course, aging and all of that. So that all said, I have to constantly make choices, not always the choices I want to make, to
Yes.
maintain the things I want to maintain. So by no means do I have it all. And if you listen to me on a bad day, you will hear me complain about the things I don't get to do as much as I want, and the things that I missed out, and the things that I might maybe never get to do, based on, how it goes. And so, I think that is how it goes. And even the most, let's say, joyous and or privileged and or lucky and or accomplished of us, right, have to deal with the fact, and I can tell you that because I work with very famous and or very rich people, and they have the exact same issues that we have, except that they don't have the luxury of suffering these things in private, which makes it, of course, way
Yeah.
worse, right? Way,
Yeah.
way, way, way worse. So,
Well, thank you for giving me the permission to be fully in this season. And I have often thought, you know what, if we have sex once a month and we just sneak it in half an hour while Artie's watching something, then great. And we have a good time and we still fancy each other. And like that's this phase. And yeah,
yeah, yeah,
we talk about cycles here. We know that the cycle will come back round.
yeah.
I'm curious, Michaela, because I can sort of imagine people listening and wondering what is it that you sense in you that enables this much life to pour through you, that enables you to maintain such a full, big life without burning out?
That's a tough question. I am Austrian, I'm not American, so I'm not that good at whatever self-promotion or however you want to call it. But I think when you ask me how do I do all the things, it's relentless discipline. I have relentless discipline that has been practiced for many, 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 many years. So I have huge capacity in applying myself both physically and emotionally and mentally, where I've just taught myself and also have been taught, and also life, right, to just stick with it, right, and not fuzz out. And the reason I can do that is I have an embodiment practice, and this brings us back to the very beginning of our conversation, is I have an embodiment practice, and there's not a day where I am not engaging with my body and checking with my body and flossing my system, so to speak, as a means of maintaining an openness and awareness. And I think the other thing that I have is a relentless pursuit of, for lack of a better word, beauty. But I don't mean beauty in the beauty of somebody's face, but beauty as in the goodliness, the goodliness and the godliness, so to speak, of nature, of of color, of texture, of flower, of animal, of sky, of a candle, so I have a very, very deep love for beauty, and there's nothing in my house anywhere that isn't arranged in somewhere. You can see
I can see it's beautiful. Yeah.
even
Yes.
my Zoom shelf gets constantly arranged, and my plants and my like my books and so I have this orientation towards um, ordinary sacredness, or sacred ordinariness. And I think that's my saving grace, because when the going gets tough, my nervous system sits in a kind of mandala, meaning in a landscape, not only my landscape, but in a landscape anywhere that is aligned and arranged in a way that I can make sense, even when it's really, really tough. And it has been, I've had several pretty horrendous things in a row happen, but I can sit there, and that kind of beauty and organization and layout and attention is the best way I can describe it is it aligns my nervous system immediately. So it doesn't matter how tough the going gets, I can put myself into that landscape, and then everything goes. And so I don't have to spend a lot of time
Yeah.
um, regulating, de-escalating, um, meditating, whatever. I just land in my surrounds, and I spend a fair share of time constantly recreating my surrounds as a means of regulating my system. And that's why I have so much energy. I mean, it's a really, and really beautiful and amazing thing. It's like I'm never really tired. Yeah.
Wow.
And I mean, sometimes I wake up, I'm a little bit, but the moment I get going with my life, I'm like, what's next? And I constantly want to do new things and create new things and write new things. And, it's like, it's this endless thing that I just love. It
Mm.
comes from my body. Yeah. So,
Yeah, yeah, that comes from your body. I'm also thinking back to your mum too, because she said she always put herself in the way of beauty, or there was always ritual. So that was really anchored in you right from the beginning.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I talked with my parents yesterday, and my sister's in-laws came to visit, and my parents are 80. My dad's 83, my mom's turning 83 in a few weeks. And my parents are like, oh yeah, we were out with them. We left at 10. We just came home at 4. And then my dad says, your mom's making dinner. And he points the camera. Thank God for FaceTime. And my mother
Yeah.
had produced like this massive board with like cheese and fruit and nuts and prosciutto and whatever, and she's like wheeling and dealing, and she's 83, right?
Amazing.
And there's like no stopping my parents, which is so cool, because they're just relentlessly embodied in even though they have quite a lot of, both of them had very debilitating bone injuries, accidents and things, but yeah, just get a joint replaced ever so often and then move on with life.
They sound amazing.
Yeah, they are amazing.
And speaking about discipline, there was a question I wanted to ask you in the last couple of minutes. Thank you for being so generous with everything you're sharing. You you created this way of practicing the nonlinear movement, and I was very moved to hear how, when tragically your home was taken by this fire, I think I was listening to an interview, it might have been with Sarah Avant Stover, and she
Mhm.
said, yeah, she's wonderful. And you said, she asked, how did you get through that? And you said, before I did anything every morning, I rolled out of bed, I got on my mat, and I did my nonlinear movement. And you said you really road tested this through that time. And it
Yeah,
was very beautiful to hear how it held you.
yeah, yeah, it really did. And this is true pretty much with everything I teach. It's road tested in either my own body or in, doing copious teaching and working with it. And so, I think in general, it doesn't have to be nonlinear movement. Nonlinear movement is super, super effective because it essentially utilizes the mechanisms of the nervous system to de-escalate and unfreeze and, regulate and all of that. But regardless of what you do, the kind of installation of something that you always do and that kind of carries you through tough periods in your life, I think is invaluable. And even if it's just your first cup of tea when you sit down on your computer, or it's I do a whole set of morning practice that's pretty much non-negotiable. That includes nonlinear movement, includes sitting facing the sun, getting so that my circadian rhythms stay really stable, includes my cards. I made this oracle deck recently. And so I, pull my own card. Now enough time has passed that I don't remember the descriptions. So I read it and I'm like, wow, this is really apropos for my, very funny. So I pull a card, I journal, I do nonlinear, I sit, and then I might add on certain things. And sometimes I also, in that time, have conversations with my partner, or, or whatever. Right? It's like I have a period of time that, regardless of what happens, is the thing that happens. And sometimes I can only spend like 3 or 4 minutes doing it. And sometimes I have an hour, but mostly it's 10, 15 minutes. But it keeps me stable regardless. And that's, I think, invaluable for anyone who wants to stay stable, is that you have a few touch points throughout your day that always stay the same, but that are for you, and not for other people, or not an activity that's for gainful employment.
This has been so beautiful. I'm so inspired. I was already, because just being around you, it's infectious, this life that you have flowing through you. So thank you for everything you do and for the time you've given us today. And yeah, blessings on everything that you're doing and all your animals.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And this was great, amazing questions. So thank you.
Oh, I'm so glad. Lots of love. Have a beautiful day. Bye.
Same to you. Bye.
Thank you for listening today. Thank you for being part of the community gathered around this podcast and this work. If you haven't yet, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts. And if you have a friend who you think would love to listen to this conversation with Michaela, then please do share this episode with them, or share something that you loved about it with a screenshot on Instagram and tag us. We would love to see what you loved, and I'd just always love to hear from you. If you have any guests that you would love us to interview, please write to me at sophie@redschool.net. And please, please do join us on June the 5th for Awaken Your Cycle Power. You can take your seat at redschool.net/cycle power. All right, that's it for this week. I'm really looking forward to being with you again next week. And until then, keep living life according to your own brilliant rhythm.